Hey everybody, Marshall here to share some really cool news with you. I trust at this point you've all heard about fake yeast. This is that Norwegian ale strain that can ferment cleanly at temperatures as high as, no joke, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 38 degrees Celsius. Absolutely crazy stuff. Well, last year, Imperial Yeast dropped A43 Loki, their Kvake strain, as a seasonal release, which meant we all had a pretty small window to get our hands on some. Not anymore. Imperial Yeast recently announced they're making A43 Loki a year-round strain due to popular demand. They're excited about it. I'm super excited about it. I've had some amazing beers fermented with Loki at terrifyingly warm temperatures. It is amazing stuff. Go grab some A43 Loki and see what all the fuss is about for yourself. There once was a time when brewers were proud of producing the clearest beer possible and developed various methods to assist in achieving this goal. I promise I'm not dissing New England IPA. In fact, some of the techniques used to clear beer can be helpful for brewers of modern hazy styles as well, one of which we're going to be focusing on today. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss not only the process of cold crashing, but more specifically the speed at which it occurs is contributor Jake Huolihan.
Cold crashing has been something that's been fascinating to me since I've started brewing. It's just a simple step that can really produce a clearer beer. But it definitely has its pros and cons to it too, and that's something I've been happy to explore during my time as a brewer. Yeah. Cold crashing is one of those things I think,
it can be difficult for new brewers only because for the most part it does require certain gear and extra steps. When I first got my first fermentation chamber years ago, I remember reading and hearing that from other people that the cold crashing process needs to be done slowly for myriad reasons. We're going to be getting into the purpose of cold crashing in general, the purported impact speed of cold crashing has on beer, and a really interesting experiment we did on this topic in just a bit. All right, I want to thank everyone out there who's made the conscious decision to support our efforts by becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. You are a huge part of the reason that we're able to keep doing this thing. If you would like to be rewarded for your support, you can become one of our patrons over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Rewards include things like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest this month is Mitch Steele from New Realm Brewing, former brewmaster at Stone Brewing and author of the book on IPA. Mitch will be taking questions this Saturday, February 22nd, so make sure to make your pledge by Friday the 21st to get in on this awesome opportunity. Past guests have included folks like John Kimmich from The Alchemist, Gordon Strong, Lars Marius Garschall, and so many more, and all past sessions are available on our private Facebook page, so you can watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And another really easy way to support us is by using the links found over at brewlosophy.com/support. Whenever you're doing your shopping online, your shopping experience doesn't change a bit, and we get a little kickback for the referrals. All right, feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Listener Adam Otwain from Texas wrote in after listening to our recent experience episode on lager fermentation. He said, my brothers own a contract brewery brand in Nashville and did a collaboration with a very highly regarded lager brewery in St. Louis. Adam says he didn't want to be too specific out of respect for the brewery. He's not sure how much info they want shared. But he goes on, the brewer told them that they turned their amazing flagship lager around in 10 days. I talked to the brewmaster owner at a lager festival last year, and he told me they pitch at the traditional 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 10 degrees C range, but at 50% attenuation, they let it ride to about 65 F or 18 C, and it finishes in a couple of days with absolutely zero flaws. I mention this because that brewery isn't some bullshit operation. If you haven't had their beers, they're some of my favorite liquids ever, and Stan Hieronymus agrees.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, you've taken it a step further, but we've kind of been doing that and getting good results now for a few years. So it's kind of validating to hear that some pro brewers are doing that and producing great beers too.
Yeah. I'm sort of with Adam and not listing off the breweries that I know are doing not so traditional lager fermentation, and only because there are people out there who, I mean, if there's gatekeeping in homebrewing, lagers is where it's at the most, is in my experience. And that's okay. If people are so, hard to just want to stick to tradition so strongly when it comes to brewing lagers, that's totally fine with me. But yeah, I know I hear from a lot of people, and we have a lot of professional brewers out there who are listening to this show, and they're doing some interesting things with making lagers. And I trust Adam that this brewery, whichever one you're thinking of here talking about, makes fantastic lagers as well. So very cool. Thanks for the feedback, Adam. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. As anyone who's been following along with Brewlosophy is likely well aware, most of us have no qualms admitting that we consume our fair share of mass market fizzy yellow lager. I'm personally a huge fan of Miller Lite myself. Jake, being from Colorado, you tend to drink when the mountains are blue, right?
Oh, no, Miller Lite. I'm from Wisconsin.
Oh, yeah, originally from Wisconsin. But hey, Colorado's got its, got a little history there in the American Light Lager thing. Well, one thing that I've loved seeing over the last few years is all of the craft breweries focusing more on crushable pale lagers. It's almost always my go-to when I go out to pubs. Well, when my friend Paul Nicodem came to town from Sydney, Australia a few months ago, he brought one such beer from Batch Brewing that's called Just Beer.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Nothing on the smell.
Nothing on the smell.
No nose feel.
Must be a lager.
Hard working, folks.
Yeah, I like it.
But you sounded tentative.
It's very nice.
Ooh, I like that, huh?
It's very good. It's clean.
It's beer.
Nailed it.
He gave us beer, dude. We stuck it. It's a beer.
We're done.
Yep,
Let's
we're done
go.
here.
We're out.
Oh, it's good.
Good. It's very good.
It's good. Good and tasty. Oh, I don't know what this is, but it's so good. We both like this, right?
Yeah.
Which means it's a hybrid of two. It's probably a mix between a sour and an IPA.
Damn, you're good, Jersey.
Yep, that's what it is. That's what it is. And everything like negated itself and it just turned into this.
Yeah.
It's light.
It's very light.
It's delicious.
Yeah.
I don't taste a lot of like distinct flavors in
Nothing.
it, but that doesn't mean anything because no, it's not true. I'm a learned man.
Break it down then.
I'll break it down. Got some esters there. Some phenols. I can tell the wort was a little probably preheated more than usual. Yeah. The pH level is a little different than I'm used to.
Maybe like 7, 8.
Don't do numbers.
This is good.
I like this a lot.
I got like a 9 going.
I'll give it a 9 too for a total of 9 to 9. We like this beer.
It's good.
Rest now, beer. Your job is done.
Hey, they nailed it, man. I think they called it just beer. It's just beer. It tasted exactly like beer. It really was a very nice pale lager, very delicious in my opinion. Nothing special at all. It was just beer, and I love it just as much as Jersey and Tim did.
I think Jersey really nailed the the brewing process that went into it too.
Yeah.
It's kind of scary how good he's getting at discerning these flavors in beers.
I know. I had a thought the other day that he might be actually going and reading the stuff that we're putting out on Brewlosophy just so he can talk about it on while doing the reviews, because he knows words that you wouldn't expect a guy like him to know. Well, Just Beer, Batch Brewing, again, doing awesome things out of Sydney, Australia, and been super stoked to have so many of their beers that my buddy Paul brought over. Thanks again to Paul for doing that. If you have a beer that you'd like Jersey and Tim to review on the show, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, when we come back, the focus will be on cold crashing. This episode is brought to you by Milwaukee-based Spike Brewing, designer and manufacturer of premium quality homebrewing equipment. Whether you're interested in upgrading to a stainless steel fermenter like the incredible Flex Plus or switching to a turnkey electric setup so you can brew inside and avoid the cold, wet winter, Spike Brewing has the solution for you. Visit spikebrewing.com/brewlosophy today and let their team help you figure out what you need to make the most of your brew day. Again, that's spikebrewing.com/brewlosophy. Spike Brewing. Pursue what's possible. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Seeing as yeast is a living organism, contentions I heard on podcasts and read online that cold crashing needs to be slow so as not to stress yeast out made some sense. I guess practical sense. I'd already adopted the idea that stressed yeast are more likely to produce undesirable off flavors, so I was absolutely for doing anything to avoid that. Before we get into the impact cold crashing speed specifically has, let's talk a little bit about what the purpose of cold crashing is in general.
So cold crashing is kind of one of those practices that, probably really started in the professional brewing realm and was adapted by home brewers. So professional brewers, traditionally when they're done fermenting, they'll transfer to a bright tank. And in that bright tank, or possibly before, they'll lower that temperature. And what this really does is it helps to promote clarity in the beer. So dropping out those solids, whether they be some sort of chill haze or yeast left over from fermentation, or really anything in there that's, that's going to promote staling. So drop those out, and then they can package completely clear beer. So what that also does is it increases the yield of a specific batch, right? You can't really be, sending out kegs that, have a couple inches of some sort of, yeast or organic material at the bottom. So really, that's kind of why they do it. And also, being cold does another thing too. It helps with the carbonation process, right? So CO2 goes into solution, quite a bit better when a liquid is cold versus when it's warm. I think, we've all probably done that where we put a keg into the keezer where it's still warm, and we start to carbonate it, and you pour those first couple glasses of that, and if it's too warm, it's just going to be foam, right?
Right.
So that's really why professional brewers do this cold crash step. And then in the homebrew realm, as people started to kind of advance with their equipment and get fridges or freezers that were dedicated, to fermentation, that ability to cold crash is there for everyone.
Yeah.
So it's just as simple as turning down your temperature controller. And then a day or so later, you've got cold, clearer beer in there.
Yeah. And the clarifying function of reducing the temperature, the way it works, there's a lot of physics that can get involved and whatnot. I'm sure people have heard the term Stokes' law. The idea behind cold crashing, at least the way it was explained to me and the way I learned about it, is that as you reduce the temperature of that beer, the yeast cells and other things are going to glom together. They're going to flock together, and the bigger that those chunks get, which they're naturally going to do as that beer gets colder, the heavier they get, and the quicker they're going to actually fall out of solution to the bottom of the tank. Like you said, there are various reasons. Clarity, I think, is the thing most people talk about when it comes to cold crashing in general. Encouraging a clearer beer. But for me, the other thing is being able to rack the cleanest beer, and by that I just mean stuff without as much particulate in it, over to the keg, so that again, you're not pulling all that junk up, pulling it over to the keg, the stuff that's going to end up settling out in the bottom of the keg anyways. And then that also can help increase yield, right? Because if you're dropping all that stuff out, you can actually rack more beer out of the fermenter as well. And I think that's something that is also obviously very beneficial to commercial brewers.
Absolutely. And in this cold crash step too, that's traditionally where professional brewers are going to add clarifying agents. They're probably not using gelatin, but, as homebrewers, we do use gelatin, and that does kind of promote, that clumping together of material that's in the beer and dropping out, and also filtration. So you really need to filter a cold beer so that these specific hazes or this yeast is apparent in the beer, so that you can run it through a filter pad and get it removed from that beer. So really just myriad of reasons why people cold crash. On our scale, like the homebrew scale, there are some, negatives to cold crashing. If you don't have a vessel that seals, you're going to suck back in some oxygen. I know we've talked about that before on different episodes, and that's definitely not the focus here. But that is definitely a con, and I think something people have been a little bit more cognizant of lately. I know I have for sure.
Absolutely.
So really, when it comes to cold crashing, there has kind of been this debate for a few years, and you kind of hinted at it, the speed at which we cold crash. So, if we're taking a beer that's fermenting, let's just say an ale, and we ramp that beer up to 72 degrees, to finish fermentation, perform a little diacetyl rest or whatever, everything's all done and we're ready to cold crash. How quickly do we want to go from 72 degrees down to, say, 32, or whatever temperature you want to perform your fining or your filtration at? How fast do we do that? Do we do that over a few days, over a week, or, with the power of a freezer or some glycol in the commercial sense, do we just do that right away? Do we drop everything out and drop it down as quick as we can?
Well, and that's I when I started cold crashing, I'm trying to get the exact year here. I think it was 2012. 2011 perhaps is when I started using this method of cold crashing. I would reduce the temperature in my chamber and very, very gently, because of what I'd heard on other podcasts or what I read online and in forums and whatnot. I was going 5 degrees Fahrenheit every 12 to 24 hours, and just the idea being that you want to treat those yeast gently, and that if you go too fast, if the temperature drops too quick, those yeasts are going to go into shock. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about what purportedly can happen when those yeasts do that. But what I was always told is that can increase the risk of acetaldehyde and other off flavors that you just don't want in your beer. And so my cold crashing process would usually take, I'd do it over the course of 3 to 4 days. And then, let that beer sit cold for another 24 hours or so before proceeding with packaging. Everyone that I knew back then was doing it that way. Nobody was, as far as I know, at least, nobody was just kicking the temperature all the way down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 C,
Oh, totally. I think I was the same way. I was probably even a little bit more conservative than you. I think I was going like 1 degree F every 12 hours because I was so worried about those off flavors that we would get. And now you look back at it and it's like, we probably had suck back and it's sitting there that cold for that many days. It's like, oh man, what was I doing to my beer then?
Exactly.
You did kind of hit on, what does happen when yeast experience, very fast temperature swings. And that's heat shock protein. So whether or not you're warming up the yeast too fast or if you're chilling it too fast, yeast can express what's called heat shock protein. And it's called heat shock even when you cool it down, which is kind of confusing at first, I think a little bit. But, I was so scared of this, I think, when I was first starting brewing that I would even take yeast that I had purchased at the homebrew store and try to chill it down slowly before throwing it in my fridge, which probably sits at about 32 degrees. So heat shock protein is definitely very real. It happens with large swings. And what that can do is not what it can do, what it does is it causes the yeast to really focus on protecting itself. And And the thought is then that it's not doing the necessary things to clean up fermentation. So you talked a little bit about acetaldehyde. If you cold crash too fast. So maybe if your fermentation was not quite complete and the yeast hadn't had a chance to clean everything up, chilling it down too quickly can cause it to go in that protection mode. So it's not cleaning up, various off flavors in the beer. It's not finishing up doing its job. And really that would be what we would call like an arrested fermentation.
That's one of the things that I've heard people talking about when it comes to cold crash speed quite a bit. In fact, is this idea that if the yeast isn't fully done working, if the beer isn't quite done fermenting, and then you just drop the temperature immediately like that. Now, obviously, if you're fermenting a 5-gallon batch in a chest freezer, and you reduce it from 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees C down to 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, it's going to take a little bit of time for that volume of beer to reduce anyways, unlike what somebody like you would do with a glycol chiller. You're literally if you wanted to, you could reduce the temperature in a matter of a few minutes, right? I mean, get it all the way down to freezing essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of goes to, I guess, fermentation philosophy. So are you planning on starting to chill your beer before it's done fermenting, like a lot of traditional lager type brewers will do? Or are you in the camp that it's like, I'm gonna let my beer get done, I'm gonna keep ramping the temperature until it is done, and then I'm gonna worry about chilling it down. So I can see why people would be worried about cold crashing it very quickly, if that was their philosophy, where they're planning on this portion of the fermentation doing things slower to, quote unquote, get a different fermentation profile. So that does make sense. And I can see why, people might have argued that and why it kind of became some sort of dogma.
Totally. And out of the world of lager brewing is where, and I talked about this in our recent lager fermentation episode, this idea that a slow reduction in temperature, even from lager fermentation temps, 10C, 50F, the slow reduction in temperature, the yeast continue to work. And again, this is something that I've heard from people who I guess abide by the very, very traditional, temperature or lager fermentation profiles, but that slow reduction allows those yeast to continue working, which is said to impart different characteristics and desirable characteristics. So not just the lack of stress necessarily, but the actual working yeast are through those that cooling phase is actually still producing some characteristics according to some.
Right, absolutely. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got fermenting something like a Belgian or maybe a Kwijk, where we're fermenting that at upwards of 70, 80, maybe even 90 or 100. I can't remember what temperature Matt did for that experiment.
I think he did 96 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. Yeah, crazy. Good
It's
Lord.
ridiculous.
I know.
But if you were to cold crash that down to 32 degrees, you're looking at like a 60 degree temperature swing,
right,
which is, that's significant. So if fermentation is not quite done yet, you're probably putting those yeast in some sort of uncomfortable situation, and maybe that big of an extreme would cause some sort of issue versus a lager fermentation where it's like you're going from 50 degrees down to 32, which it's not even 20 degrees. That's pretty small.
Yeah, much smaller delta. One of the thoughts that I had when I started kind of rethinking my cold crashing process, because the way I do it today is way different than what I used to do. First off, cold crashing is not a necessary step. It's not something that you have to do to make good, clear beer. Your beer is eventually going to be chilled anyways. This was one of those thoughts that kind of made me start thinking that maybe I don't need to take so much time to drop the temperature of my fermenting beers, particularly when I'm making ale. You can rack a warm beer over to a keg, which you do that all the time, right, Jake? That's kind of your process nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you rack that warm beer, so it's 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees C or so, gets into a keg. you take that keg usually and you throw it in your keezer or your kegerator. I don't know about you, but I keep mine at 36 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is about 2 degrees Celsius. That's an immediate cold crash if you look at it that way. And those beers come out fine. And it was that process. It was me skipping cold crashing proper, and doing packaging a warm beer and throwing it in the keezer that kind of made me scratch my head and say, wait a minute, I'm basically doing that is a cold crash in effect. Why am I not getting these off flavors that I've been told, can happen if I go too quick?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that came up like in an online comment somewhere sometime, and I had never even, really considered that. And then you take a step back and it's like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm cold crashing it from, whatever the temperature I had ramped fermentation up to, because I keg everything warm, and I know a lot of people do, like especially people that don't have the ability to cold crash in the fermentation vessel,
right?
Throwing it in a keg and then dropping it in the keezer, where it's probably going to get down to temperature in like less than probably 12 hours. So, that is pretty quick. And like you said, we're not getting, or at least we're not perceiving these specific off flavors that are said to become apparent when yeast goes into that heat shock mode. So what gives here?
Yeah. And then again, the other thought that I had, I mentioned this earlier, is the fact that when I could go and set my temperature controller on my fermentation chamber from 68 Fahrenheit down to 32 degrees Celsius. And again, that beer, that volume of beer is going to slowly drop in temperature anyways. And that thinking about that, I was kind of like, God, I feel like I'm prolonging this thing unnecessarily, is where my thinking started to go. I was talking to some folks back years and years ago who don't have fermentation chambers, but they use ice bottles, right? So they do like the water bath type of thing, keep their fermenter in water, and that regulates the fermentation temperature. And then once the beer is completely done fermenting, they just throw in a bunch of frozen water bottles, so ice, and they're able to get that beer down over, I would imagine overnight, basically, but they're able to get the temperature of that beer down, to the low 40s, low to mid 40s, which is pretty good, and that's happening relatively quickly. That's going to be a difficult way. You're going to struggle to control that temperature drop when you're using such a rudimentary method.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, there are so many different ways that people can go about cold crashing. On the professional scale and on the homebrew scale, it's really, an area that just has endless possibilities. I mean, somebody could wrap a fermentation vessel in some sort of cold exo wrap. I forget what it's called, but I've seen that around. But really, there are just so many different ways you can do it. And people are doing it, every different way. People are doing it fast. People are doing it cold. So really, that's been something that's kind of always fascinated me, and something I really wanted to test out when I finally got the ability to cold crash very, very quickly.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the ways that we cold crash. I think you have the dream set up over there. So I get emails from people. This is how weird of a method this whole cold crashing speed thing is. I get emails from people asking me where I put my probe using my fermentation chamber. Like it's that big of a deal, So I've got various different fermentation vessels at this point, and some of them have thermal wells that you can actually stick the probe into during fermentation and whatnot. And then what I usually do, and what I've always done with Carboys and the SS brew buckets, the Flex Plus that I've got from Spike, I still just keep the probe behind. I've got some insulative backing, so it's like, I don't know, like it's bubble wrap essentially, it's like foil bubble wrap stuff, and I keep the probe taped to that, and then I tape that whole thing to my fermentation vessel. But when I get around to the cold crashing, to the point of reducing the temperature in the chamber, I actually remove the probe from sticking to the side of my fermentation vessel and let it actually drop the temperature of the chamber. But these days, my thing is, I just drop the temperature of the chamber immediately down to what I want the beer to get to. I'm not doing that staggered, slow cold crashing thing anymore. But again, by regulating the temperature of the inside of that freezer, I do feel like it's not happening too fast because it's going to drop the temperature of the inside of the freezer. And then that's going to kind of sit around like that for a little while that beer is reducing in temperature much more slow.
Right. If you were to you have yours in a freezer. If you were to have that attached or have that in a thermal well where you're measuring the temperature of the beer, and you set that beer to become 32 degrees or whatever you want it to be, that freezer is going to get down to 0F or whatever a freezer gets down to. It's going to chill it much faster than the way you're going. And that's not even the first method that you had. Didn't you used to have a temperature controller that you could set schedules in and kind of regulate it down like that?
Yeah, no. Good reminder. I was using the black box fermentation chamber or not the chamber, but it was the temperature regulator. Really cool for scheduled or like fermentation programs. If you have a certain profile you want to do and your timing and all of that, that kind of stuff. But then I would go in and set this cold crashing program setup that I had, and I'd go click on that, and it would, again, every 12 hours it would reduce something like 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 2 degrees C, and I wouldn't have to touch it, but it would still take forever. And again, nowadays I just go remove that probe off the side, let it dangle in the fermentation chamber, and set the temp down to 32, 33 F. Really, the biggest reason I do that has a little to do with the speed component and my fears of yeast stress, and more to do with the fact I just don't want the compressor in my freezer to be running as often as it would have to if that probe stayed attached to the fermentation vessel.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely one of the ways to prolong or shorten your freezer's life.
Yeah, hopefully. That's
right. So what I used to do, I fermented in a refrigerator for quite a few years, and I would just kind of do what you did with the bubble wrap and the probe on the fermentation vessel. And then when I wanted to get around to that cold crash step, I would just turn the temperature of the fridge all the way down to where I wanted it. And a fridge is not quite as cold as a freezer. So it's going to get down to, I think I had it set to like the warmest setting the fridge would go. So the fridge just runs normally as it would. And if a fridge, once it gets to a certain temperature, it's going to turn off. So I felt like that was a pretty good in-between ground to raising the temperature, or reducing the temperature slowly compared to actually going out there and turning it down a few degrees every day. So I felt like I was, still doing it slowly, but not as labor intensive as it would have been.
Yeah, and not nearly as haphazard as you could be, I guess. But nowadays you're running glycol, which is just amazing. I'm jealous, but you have the ability to reduce temperatures as quickly as you want. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. And when I first got it, I didn't really quite understand the power of glycol until I think one day when it was really warm in the summer. And I was just out there sweating, brewing, and I was sick of chilling when my beer was still 100 degrees. So I just racked it into a fermentation vessel and hooked it up to the glycol. And it was down to 50 degree pitching temps in 15 minutes. It was ridiculous.
That's so nice.
It kind of put the idea in my mind that, whenever I want to test this cold crash variable out, I can get one of these beers down to 32 degrees in a matter of minutes. It's not going to take very long. So really, I'd be testing probably the most extreme that really any home brewer for sure, and probably, any brewer can possibly test it, I guess outside of dropping dry ice into the beer.
Yeah. What is your typical, using such a powerful chilling method as glycol, what is your typical cold? Are you still kegging mostly warm beer? Do you cold crash or is that something you feel safe doing now because of the setup that you've got so that you're not getting that suck back or?
Right. So I have two different methods, and it depends on what my fermentation vessel is. So if I'm using my brew buckets, where I can't really apply positive pressure, I mean, I could, but you're going to have leakage, and it's not really the best thing to do to have those brew buckets under pressure for an extended period of time. So with those, I typically just don't cold crash. I'll go through my fermentation cycle, ramp it up a little bit to clean up any off flavors and speed up attenuation, and then I'll just keg it and throw in the keezer. With the unit tanks, where I can actually cut off outside pressure and cut off outside airflow and allow a little pressure to build up in the unit tank, then yeah, I'll just cold crash as soon as it's built up the pressure gauge stops moving, which would indicate fermentation is done because no more CO2 is being produced. I'll just drop that temperature down. It depends on how I'm feeling, I guess. Like sometimes I'll just like drop it down 10 degrees a day. I mean, because it's really not that difficult. But I really have no qualms about just dropping it down to, I think I do about 38 when I'm in those, just to put less stress on the glycol system itself.
Yeah, that's another thing that I've considered as well, is that regardless of, outside of the impact that fast cold crashing might have on the beer, right? Because of the yeast stress and all that stuff. Part of it also is the stress that it puts on the gear that you're using. And, I've always wondered with glycol, at some point, I mean, you've only got a big enough reservoir, right, to hold so much glycol. At some point, does that start to kind of warm up at all? Or is it keeping it super cold all the time?
Yeah, so basically the glycol system itself, you can think of it the same as you think of a controller for your fermentation vessel. So it holds 3 gallons, and I think it's a mixture of 1 gallon of pure glycol and 2 gallons of distilled water. So what that does is there's some pumps in there that'll pump it through coils in your fermentation vessel. It picks up heat very efficiently. So then the reservoir becomes warm, and there's a controller on there that kicks it on there to cool it. Like this time of the year where it's kind of cold here in Colorado, my garage stays at about like 40, 45. So I'm not too worried about keeping beers cold because they're going to be cold naturally if I did nothing to them in the garage. But like in the summer, if it's like 90 degrees in my garage, I'm not going to be sitting there holding a beer at like 34 degrees just because it's going to constantly be cycling on and off and constantly be running the compressor on the glycol chiller itself just to keep that reservoir cold.
Yeah. Yeah, sort of my argument with the way that I do it with my fermentation chamber, the chest freezer basically, is I don't want that compressor to burn out. So I do it the way that I do, and it'll kick on for, I don't know, 30 minutes a day, something like that in total, when I'm doing the cold crash step. So, but yeah, as someone who trusted what I'd heard about the problems associated with cold crashing too quickly, I was really interested to see what kind of impact it would actually have. Results from an experiment on cold crashing speed when we return from this break.
The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free Recipe Creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com.
I know not every brewer is as impatient as me, but I think most are interested in reducing steps that unnecessarily prolong the time it takes to go from grain to glass. If I'm able to shave off time by cold crashing immediately rather than going back to my firm chamber multiple times over a few days, I will, but only if it doesn't damage my beer. This is exactly what you explored in a recent experiment, Jake.
Absolutely. So with recently getting the ability to cold crash very quickly and have no suckback or risk of cold side oxidation, I really decided to test out this cold crash speed, not necessarily myth, but this argument, to see if it really had an impact and to see if I was hurting my lager beers by crashing them quickly. So I brewed up a single 10-gallon batch of Helles. I think I used 97% Pilsner malt, and then 2% Carahel and 1% Melanoidin, which I think is my standard Helles recipe and makes a really nice light yellow beer. So I mashed those in my SS Infusion mash tuns, which is really nice because I can do a full volume, no sparge mash. I mashed it at 156, which is 69C, for 60 minutes, stirring every 15 minutes just to promote conversion and get rid of any dough balls that might be in there. After that 60 minutes was up, I racked that into my boil kettle and then boiled for 60 minutes, adding 24 grams of laurel at 60 minutes and then 15 grams of laurel at 30 minutes, which it's a really nice hop for a Helles when you add it early in the boil, I found. And then after the boil was complete, so after 60 minutes, I chilled down the wort really quick and took a refractometer reading showing that I'd gotten 13 Plato, which is 1053 OG. I split that after it had chilled and settled out into my 2 SS unit tanks. I then connected those to my glycol system and chilled them further down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 10C, very quickly actually, which is nice. And then pitched a single pouch of Imperial's L17 Harvest into each unit tank. I think I added oxygen then for 60 seconds each. Just something I do. I know we've yet to show that it really matters. I don't know why I still do it. Then I let those beers alone for 5 days. So they were allowed to kind of ferment out. And then I capped them and allowed them to pressurize up to 10 PSI. So really, because I'm not using a spunding valve, this is kind of a guessing game for me. So as fermentation starts to wind down, so as the bubbles become less and less in the blow off, I'll cap it and then kind of check it 30 minutes later, check it 30 minutes later. And if the pressure is building up too much, bleed that back down and finally get to a point where I'm at about 10 PSI in each of those. At this point, I raised the temperature to 56F or 13C just for a little diacetyl rest, finish up fermentation, and clean up any off flavors that were potentially there. So after a week with no pressure movement, I figured these beers were done. I did take hydrometer measurements there and confirmed that they were both at the same specific gravity point, which was 1015, which makes sense given my higher mash temperature. So now we are ready to introduce the variable here. So for one of the unit tanks, the one that was going to be cold crashed quickly, I set the temperature on my glycol system to 36F, which is 2C, and it took just over an hour to go from 56F down to 36F. And I think the bulk of that chilling happened pretty quickly. I think it was like those last 4 degrees Fahrenheit that kind of took longer, which makes sense because I think I have my glycol set to like 34 degrees. Yeah. So it's going to take a lot more to chill down from 38 to 36 with 34 degree liquid. Yeah. And then for the slow cold crashed one, What I did was I reduced the temperature 2 degrees Fahrenheit or about 1 degree Celsius every 12 hours until it was also at 36 degrees. And this took a total of 10 days. So went down, 20 degrees, right? 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees C about. So it makes sense that it took about 10 days to do that.
Now, my understanding was that you reduced it 1 degree Fahrenheit every 12 hours, but 2 degrees per day, basically Fahrenheit. So 1 degree Celsius per day. Maybe I'm just mistaken on that.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense because I recall it taking 10 days total.
Yeah,
which was a long time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes sense. So as soon as those beers were down to 36 degrees, as soon as they were both down to 36 degrees, I packaged them 1 day later. What I did was I hooked up a CO2 line that I have to the unitank and pushed it into purged kegs. And then I put them in my keezer. They were already slightly carbonated. I just cranked up the PSI on the keezer a little bit just to help them along and finish up. And then I let them condition in the keezer for about a week before they were served to tasters. Because they were already cold for like 10 days, they were pretty clear when they went into the keg. So really the conditioning step here, I don't think was as crucial as some might claim in different experiments.
Yeah. Well, and you intentionally skipped any sort of fining on this because we wanted to see the impact that cold crashing speed would have on clarity, as well as anything else, perceptible stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I intentionally skipped fining on all my beers, but so initially, like right when they went into the keg, the one that was cold crashed quicker was a little bit clearer, which makes sense. I mean, it was colder for longer. But after a week in the keezer, they both looked the same. I mean, they're both clear, great looking yellow beer. So prior to getting some data on this, I gave myself 5 semi-blind triangle tests, and I only got 2 out of 5 correct. And it was just a guess. They tasted identical to me. Really, from the time I got them down to 36 degrees equally, through the entire time they were on tap, they never tasted different to me. They were both great, and they both tasted the exact same. But it doesn't really matter how I do on the triangle test. We're more interested in what blind participants would think or would get for this specific variable. So I served it to 21 participants. So at 21, we would need a correct total of 12 to have a significant result at our chosen p-value. In all actuality, we got 5, which is just a little bit under 1/4. And right in line pretty much with random guessing.
Yeah, 5 out of 21. That would strongly suggest that these beers were probably a lot more similar than they were different. People just could not distinguish the beer that was cold crashed quickly from the one that was cold crashed slowly. And for me, because I had already switched to quicker cold crashing, this just provided a little bit of validation for my process, kind of serving to ease any concern that might have been residual, that it might have been left over. But I've been cold crashing fast for so long, and I've never, ever noticed anything negative about it, at least in my experience.
And with this specific experiment too, I think it's kind of key to note that both beers were done fermenting, prior to cold crashing. So this really isn't testing, what some people will do as they're slowly lowering the temperature with lager beers as there is still extract in the beer to be fermented. So this was purely taking 2 completely fermented beers and, cold crashing one and slowly crashing the other one. So even if the yeast were put into some sort of heat shock, there was nothing necessarily left for them to do. So they probably just went into that protective mode, dropped out of solution, and we're done.
Yeah. And that's key, I think, is making sure that fermentation is complete, before you're going into it. I'm certain that there are people out there who have never perhaps heard that you need to cold crash slowly, or just who haven't been doing it for a while, who are listening going, well, duh. Yeah, it doesn't have that big of an impact. But for people like me, these kind of results are really interesting because I was raised at a time in brewing when it came to cold crashing that you absolutely did not do it quickly. You were always told by everybody that you want to do it slow. You got to treat those yeast, well. And these results just kind of confirm this idea that perhaps our understanding of what's actually going on during the cold crashing process, at least as it goes, with yeast and the off flavors that they might emit, perhaps isn't, what we've been told maybe isn't necessarily terribly accurate.
Absolutely. It was definitely a comforting experiment for me. Like I said, I have really, in essence, been cold crashing very quickly forever just because I keg warm beer and throw it in my keezer. But having these side by side and knowing I treated one, quote unquote, very, very well by slowly coddling that yeast down. And the fact that I couldn't tell a difference between that and one that was quickly cold crashed, really kind of put me at ease and made me pretty confident in using the methods that I had been using.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can turn around beer quicker. I mean, if it doesn't take you 4 days to cold crash, it takes you just one. That's beer in the keg getting poured into your glass, 3+ days sooner than otherwise. And I think that's pretty cool. Well, we've got some reader comments I'd like to get to. The first one comes from Luca, who says, I think the topic is really interesting since slow cold conditioning makes the whole brewing process a lot longer, which is annoying. So well done. 2 comments. 1, supporters of the gradual process suggest to chill the beer as slow as 1 degree Celsius per day, which is 2 times slower than what has been done in this experiment. That's the first point. And then the second point, Lucas says, temperature shock is said to make yeast excrete lipids interfering with head retention. Did you happen to see any differences in that regard? So again, the first one, he mentions the recommendation to reduce it by 1 degree Celsius per day, which is like a 1.5, 2 degrees Fahrenheit per day. I think that is what you did.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look around for recommendations in terms of how fast you can cold crash, you're going to find, temperature. You're going to find 1 degree C. You're going to find 2 degrees C. You're probably going to find 0.5 degree C somewhere. It just all depends probably where you're looking. In terms of the second question, I did not notice any differences in head retention. They both seem to have a pretty great head.
Yeah, I've heard that argument as well, though, that the pretty much when you're reducing, you're shocking those yeast by throwing them into that really cold environment too fast that they release these lipids, and lipids will, I think there's good science backing this up, have an impact on head formation and retention. I make a lot of beer, and most of them have decent head retention, and I'm cold crashing all of them very quickly. So that's not something that I've seen as being a result or consequence of cold crashing too quickly. So second comment comes from Damon, who says, great write-up and thanks for sharing the results. In your introduction, you said, quote, I've not regularly cold crashed in a while, mostly due to fears of cold side oxidation. Can you please elaborate on what method you're using to get the yeast to flocculate if you don't cold crash?
So really, the yeast doesn't flocculate until I get it in my keg and throw it in my keezer. I go back and forth, but typically I'm not in a huge rush to drink the beers that I just put on tap. So I'm fine just leaving them sit in the keezer for a week. And then those first couple pints will be a little hazier, but it goes away. If I really want to clear beer quickly, I'll use that clear beer draft system, which pulls from the top. So as the yeast is flocculating in the keg, you're getting that clear beer from the top.
Yeah. I'm still a cold crasher. Like you, Jake, my bigger concern with it these days has nothing to do with potential off flavors being excreted by the yeast, but has more to do with that suck back and the oxidation that can occur because of that. And again, we've talked about this in past episodes, but nowadays I usually, when I'm cold crashing in the primary fermenter, I usually have CO2 connected to the fermentation vessel, or I'll pump up a balloon. We call this the balloon lock, with CO2, and then replace the airlock with this CO2 filled balloon and allow the CO2 to get sucked back in. It's pretty interesting to observe that. You realize just how much air is getting sucked into your fermenter during that cold crashing process, it'll take a good, third of a full balloon of CO2, which is quite a bit, and that's, I don't want that oxygen going into the beer. So I again, that's why I use this balloon lock or these days I just cold crash under CO2 pressure. But again, you don't have to necessarily do that to get your yeast to flock. They will eventually start to settle out if they're not working anymore. I mean, we've all made beer that cleared up in the fermentation vessel without it being cold. I mean, that could happen, and often does. So once you get it into the keg, again, stuff's going to fall out in the keg anyways. You pull off those first couple of pints and it'll be just fine. To me, it's, I would do that before cold crashing without some form of CO2 going in, because the too risky in my opinion. And I don't like oxidized beer.
It's crazy. We can't go through an episode without talking about cold side oxidation. I think it's like the single most important thing in making good beer.
Yeah. I mean, it's become a big area of focus, and to me, it's worth minding. So, well, the next comment comes from Larry Eder. He says, the results are pretty much what I would have expected. A real and practical question arising from this experiment is, what's the impact on beer brewed using harvested yeast that's either been rapidly or slowly crashed? One would suppose that a slow crashed yeast would be more healthy due to less stress.
I mean, possibly, but I think every time I would make like a yeast starter, I pretty much, if I'm not dumping in the entire yeast starter, I would throw it in my fridge and let that crash. And it's not a huge volume of liquid, so it does drop out of there pretty quickly, and I was having great fermentations and, no real off flavors noted.
Yeah, I've used quite a bit of yeast from cakes from prior batches that were cold crashed fast. I can't say that I noticed any off flavors, anything. It's a good question, and I think it's a decent hypothesis, right? That if your cold crashing fast does lead to some form of more stress on the yeast, then that yeast in future batches potentially could have issues, I guess. But it's just not. Again, it's not something I've seen, and it's not something that I'm going to worry about at this point. That yeast is probably still, compared to a pouch of yeast that's been sitting in your fridge for 3 months, it's probably still healthier than that. Yeah,
absolutely.
All right, next comment comes from Ben. He says, with your fermenters and process, you are able to single out the rate of temperature change as the only variable. But for many brewers who can't pressurize their fermenters, oxygen ingress may also be an important secondary effect of a quick cold crash. I'd be interested to see a similar experiment done with a carboy and airlock to see if a quick cold crash leads to increased suckback or oxygen ingress and a noticeable difference in a triangle test. Jake, I believe you actually sort of tested this one out.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with that proposed experiment is that they're both going to have suckback. I mean, if you lower that temperature slowly or if you lower it quickly, an equal amount of space is getting displaced by the contraction of that volume of liquid. So they're both going to be, I guess, oxidized to some degree.
Now, whether that has a noticeable impact or not, I don't think that the cold crash speed in a carboy with an airlock that's sucking oxygen in, like you said, they're both going to suck in the same amount. It's just going to happen over a different amount of time, which I guess I can't imagine that's going to have any impact on the beers in some unique way. But how about just don't cold crash like that and put some sort of a balloon on your fermenter so you don't get oxidized beer?
Right.
Here we go again, right? Talking about it again. So
yeah. Now I would be really interested to try 2 cold crashes in my unit tanks where one of them is like capped off, so there's no suckback occurring, and then the other one's just wide open, so it's sucking in all that oxygen, and try to see if we could, find a difference there.
Yeah. I mean, depending on the style of beer, I mean, if it's a New England IPA, my hunch would be that there's probably going to be, or more likely to be, a difference than if it were just something less hoppy. For some reason, there's something about these hoppier IPAs that seem to be more sensitive to the cold side oxidation when it comes to stuff like this. So that's something interesting to think about for sure. Final comment comes from Reddit user Alex Vapp. For me, this gradual chilling is, quote, bro science. When you're cold crashing, it means your wort has been fermented, so the yeast are sleeping already. Cooler temps will wake them up and allow them to make off flavors in like a few hours. Seems hard to believe. That's why I'm not surprised by these results. But it's always better to have backup like your experiments to prove this. First comment on that is that I got to say it, same way we talk about cold side oxidation all the time. We talk about how our experiments don't really prove anything. They just provide another point of data about an interesting variable. And so I'm not sure it proves anything. It might confirm what you already believed, and that's fine. That's what this did for me as well. So,
and to kind of go to like the whole like bro science-y question or whatever, you're right in the comment that these beers were done fermenting. And I think that a lot of the dogma surrounding cold crash speed is in fact those beers that are still actively fermenting or still do have a few points of gravity left at the point when the brewer starts to lower that temperature.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I have to wonder, with my experience not doing a gradual cold crash process, plus, kind of combined with the results of this, where exactly this idea that you should go slow when cold crashing really came from. I'm sure there's sound science behind the theory of what could possibly happen, but it really just doesn't seem to have much of a perceptible impact on beer. And so, at the end of the day, I'm going to be cold crashing quickly, as I have been for the last few years. That is all the time that we've got. We've kind of dug our pretty deeply into this idea of cold crashing speed. Jake, do you have anything else before we wrap things up?
No, really. I think if you want to cold crash, go ahead and do that. But try to limit that cold side oxidation. I think that's, one of the biggest things that I take away from, all of this delving into cold crashing and the various speeds you can do it at. It's just make sure your beer's not touching air.
Amen to that. And don't forget to head over to brewlosophy.com to read up on the experiment discussed in this episode, as well as all of the other stuff we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.